This tutorial is to show how two fragments can be placed in an Android activity and then made to communicate with each other. So let's create our activity first of all, called MainActivity, and create our two fragments. So we'll call them TopFragment and Bottom Fragment. So for our activity class, we extend activity, and for our fragments class, we extend fragment. The next thing we want to do is create a layout file for each of these. So go to our resources directory here, do new Android resource directory. The type of directory is layout. So we need 3 XML files here. So one layout resource file. Now for the activity, in this case we are going to use linear layout because we're laying out just 2 fragments. In portrait mode they'll be below each other in a line, and in landscape mode they'll be beside each other in a line. So we have activity main with a linear layout for our activity. So there we go, and let's create the 2 for the fragments as well, and these will be relative layout. So we've got fragment top and fragment bottom. Again, remembering to use relative layout within each fragment. Next thing we want to do is go to our AndroidManifest file and declare our main activity. So we'll have the usual default setup in here from scratch, and what we do is we create our activity tag. Okay, so the next thing we want to do is design both of our fragments. So let's do fragment top first of all. So what we're going to do here is put in 2 spinners, which will hold a origin and destination for our flight. So here we go. So let's drag a spinner there, and drag another spinner in below it, and then drag a button in below those, which we will use to click on to search for the flights. Okay, so next thing we need to do is do a bit of tweaking in our XML. Before we do that, let's go to our strings.xml within our resources and declare a couple of strings and a couple of string arrays. I'm going to use string arrays to populate the spinners. But first off, we're going to add a new string resource for our button caption. So there we go, it's the ID button caption, and we're going to call it find flights. The next thing we're going to add is a string array called origins, which is going to contain all of our cities that we want to have in our origins spinner or drop down. And secondly, we're going to have another string array with our destinations. Okay, so European origins here, US destinations here. Okay, so let's go back to our top fragment into the XML. And first thing we want to do here, we give some meaningful IDs. So let's call this spinner origin, and the next one destination. So we need to change the layout below parameters here as well to match the new. So this one is below the origin and this one is below the destination. So we've got spinner, spinner and button. So we can see here we've got the actual hard-coded text for the button, so let's use our string resource there instead. So what we do is at string, and we see the autocomplete there comes with our button caption that we've added in the string resources. Then what we do is specify the values that we want to put into our spinners. So for that we use Android:entries and we point it at the array called destinations, which we have defined in our strings.xml. So we use the @array identifier there, and likewise here for our destination. Sorry, one of them is going to be array origins and the other is going to be array destinations. Okay, so that's that done. So let's now go to our fragment code, the top fragment. We've no code in here yet, so let's override the onCreateView method as normal. So like this. We'll do Alt and Enter to organize our imports. So we organize the rest of our imports, so press Alt and Enter. You just place the cursor over these, click and do Alt and Enter. Okay, so the most important thing we see here is that layout inflator is the object which gets passed in, which does the connection between this fragment and the XML file. So we call inflator.inflate and we look up our layout file for this fragment using the OR object, so or.layout.fragmentTop. And supply in the argument container here, the view group which gets passed in, and also false. Okay, but we're not too concerned about these, but the most important part is this piece of the code here. Okay, and that's going to return us the fully created view with all our components, so we return that. So the next thing we want to do is allow this fragment to communicate outside itself. So when fragments are communicating between each other, they have to do that through their parent activity. So we have TopFragment here, which wants to communicate with bottom fragment. It's going to have to do that through the activity that they share, that they both have as their parent. So the first thing we do is define an interface to allow this fragment to communicate out to its parent activity. So you can call the interface whatever you want. This is called flight searcher with the method search for flight. So this interface is for outward communication from this fragment. So to allow that communication to happen, the activity has to implement this interface. So let's go to activity, we'll do implements, and the interface is an inner interface similar to an inner class of TopFragment. So we do TopFragment dot flight searcher. And we then implement the method and there is search for flights. Okay, so that's our implementation of this interface which TopFragment is communicating out through. So it's in here that we're going to do the communication to the bottom fragment. So there's a handy method here called getFragmentManager, which allows you to find fragments by their ID. So again, we use or.id. And we see here that there is no ID for the fragments. So what we need to do here is place the fragments within the linear layout of our activity. So basically saying within the XML of the activity that it contains two fragments. And that's where we will give each fragment its ID. So if we move to activity main.xml, we can see at the moment that we have an empty linear layout. So what we want to do here is add our first fragment using the fragment tag and point it at our fragment class. Next we add the fragment ID. In this case we're giving it the ID TopFragment. And finally 3 layout parameters. Which are layout weight 1, which is how much ratio it takes up compared to other fragments, and then we just have layout width match parent and layout height match parent. I'm just going to fix. So that's flight search.TopFragment, and we then do something similar for bottom fragment. So we place that in below. So we now have 2 fragments referring to the 2 different classes, top fragment and bottom fragment, and they have respective IDs, top fragment and bottom fragment. And the ratio of them is 1:1, so they each take up half of this available space in their parent activity. So we can now go back to MainActivity, where we were implementing the interface which received the message from TopFragment, and here we want to look up the bottom fragment. We now see that that ID appears there automatically for us. So when we look this up, we're going to get something back, and we know we can cast it to bottom fragment. Like that. So that means that information can come in here from the top fragment. We get reference to the bottom fragment here, and we can call methods on that. And this is all being managed within this class, which is the activity. So let's just put in our normal implementation of the onCreate method in our activity. Okay, so the main thing it's doing here is calling super.onCreate and then calling setContentView and reading the XML layout file that's associated with this activity. So the next thing we want to do is go and design our bottom fragment. We haven't put anything in there yet, so if we have a look at our relative layout here, we don't have anything in there. And all we want to do here really is just put in a text field to allow us to display the result that we pass from the top fragment to the bottom fragment. So let's just put in a plain text view here at the top. And we'll change that to an edit text. And keep the text blank in there to start with. Let's just move it down a little bit. Okay. Let's also give it a meaningful ID, so we'll call it flight query result. So now, like we do for all fragments, we go to our bottom fragment class and we override the onCreateView method. And this time we're inflating the bottom fragment XML. So we just organize our imports here. Okay, so we obviously want to display the result that travels over from the top fragment in here, so we need to provide a method that can be called to do that. So let's call it display flight query result and have it take in a string called result. Here we can look up our edit text by its ID, so we'll call it result field. Now an important thing to note here is we want to look up the component by its ID, but that can only be done by an activity. So find view by ID is not a method that's available in Fragment, however we can just do get activity, find view by ID, and then do or.id flight query result, which is the field, the ID of the text field. And we know that would be an edit text because that's what we created it as. And then we simply do result field dot set text result, which is what we're passed in. Okay, so that's bottom fragment complete. If I go back to MainActivity now, when we receive in the origin and destination from the bottom fragment through this interface, we can then call bottom fragment dot set bottom fragment dot display flight query result and put some string in there. So okay, we need to construct our result string here. So let's do something like origin plus a dash plus destination, and let's have that equal to a random price. So we could, for example, here generate a random price, let's say between 0 and 200 euros. So the usual way of generating a random number. So mat.random multiplied by 200 and round that off to an int, so that will give us a random price, which we can tag onto the end here. So we should get something like Paris dash New York equals, and then a random number between 0 and 200. So that would be our constructed result string, which we then pass to be displayed in the bottom fragment. So one of the final things we have to do in the code is go back and do a little bit of work in TopFragment. So here we can see that we've implemented an interface to allow this fragment to communicate outwards, and our activity implements that interface. So when we click the button in this top fragment to find flights, we will want to send the selected destinations out of this fragment through that interface. So this interface, or this fragment, will need to know about the activity which implements that interface. So usually the way we do that is through the onAttach method, which is the first lifecycle method of a fragment. So it's when the activity initially communicates and attaches itself to this fragment. So what we do here is we receive in an activity, we call it context, we call it super.onAttach context. Now what we want to do in here is declare a variable called flight searcher. So that's our interface. So let's call it interface implementer. So this .interface implementer will equal the activity which has been passed in from the outside. The next thing we want to do is, well, if we think about where we are in the onAttach here, that's the very first method in the life cycle. Then we create the view. And after we've created the view, we need to set up a listener on the button. So to do something when the button is clicked. So there's a method here called onActivity created. So these three methods you can see here. This is the order in which they get called in the life cycle. And onActivity gets created when the activity that's contained is completely created and it's fully created all the fragments within it, so we can be sure all the GUI components are there. So therefore we can add listeners onto them. So let's first of all find our button. So we call it flight search button. Again, here we do get activity dot find view by ID or .id dot, there's button. So we know we're getting a button back here, so we cast it. So next we want to set up a click listener on this button. So flight search button dot set on click listener. And we do an anonymous inner class here. So in here what we got to do is when the button is clicked, we want to get a reference to both spinners. So like this, again doing get activity find view by ID and passing in the ID of each one and storing a reference to each spinner. So finally what we're going to do is get the string that's selected in each spinner and pass it out through this interface up here. So we'll do interface implementer dot search for flights. So it will be origin spinner dot get selected item to string and destination spinner dot get selected item dot to string. So one final thing here in this method, we must make sure that we call super dot onActivity created. And if we now run our app, it's going to look something like this. So we have our spinners where we can select origin and destination. So let's do, say, London to San Francisco. Click find flights, and on this top fragment the data gets passed to the bottom fragment and you get your final message displayed. Okay, one final point to note here, that if we currently change the orientation of the device, the fragments still appear on top of each other, which may not always be desirable. So what if we want to make these fragments appear beside each other when the device changes to landscape orientation? So what we do is go to our project, to our layout directory, create a new layout resource file. Okay, so this is also going to be called activity main. It's also going to be linear layout. So in Android Studio, the way you do it here is you specify orientation down the bottom here, add it across, and then do landscape. And you can see here you get the layout land directory. So the way it appears here in Studio is you get two Android, or you get two activity main.xmls. So if we just look at our existing one for portrait, what we do is we just copy that, paste it in here, but the only thing we want to change in the landscape one is that instead of the orientation of our linear layout being vertical, we now want it to be horizontal. So if we now run that in our emulator, we see in portrait mode that the top fragment and bottom fragment appear stacked on top of each other. If we switch the orientation to landscape, we now see that the two fragments appear beside each other in horizontal orientation linear layout.